Hi, everybody. This is Michael, and welcome to the Restoring Freedom Intensive session on intimacy, part 2. This evening, we're going to be talking about intimacy, but it's the second of 2 conversations. So if you are listening tonight and you are just tuning in, you may want to go back and watch the first video called Restoring Freedom Intensive Intimacy number 1. Let's go ahead and pray. Father God, Lord Jesus, and Holy Spirit, thank you that you're present here, even through the technology, and even as men will watch this much later, perhaps days later, and people might even see this weeks or months later. I ask that your Spirit would open the eyes of all who are watching and listening to this message, that you would awaken their hearts to see you more clearly and to see the nature of relationship and intimacy more clearly. And I pray that you'd use this for the healing of their hearts, the deepening of their relationships and friendships. And so I pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so tonight, again, we'll teach for 45 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A section. I do have the question bar in the edge of my computer, so anybody watching ought to be able to simply send in a question about the topic. And feel free to send in questions from last week's topic as well, Intimacy Part 1. So we talked about how intimacy is rooted in the idea of the Trinity. We talked about 7 myths about intimacy, the 7th of which was that intimacy is unreasonable or that it's not possible. And in fact, intimacy is not only reasonable, it's what our hearts hunger for. And it is possible because of what God has done to reconcile us to himself and to reconcile us to one another and to give us a true connection to our true self. So tonight, we're going to talk about, as I defined intimacy last week, as the experience of being who we most truly are in the presence of another person who's being who they most truly are, an intimate relationship that neither person hides or silences or sacrifices who they most truly are in order to win attention, affection, approval, or involvement from the other person. Intimacy involves having the freedom to offer our true feelings, thoughts, desires, and boundaries within relationship to one another. So that's kind of the definition. There's 3 parts to that, and it's a long definition, but it begs the question that some of you may be asking. And remember, the context of teaching about intimacy is this. If sexual addiction and porn addictions are false intimacy, then what is real intimacy? And that's why we're having this conversation. This is not to help us, quote, fine-tune or recalibrate our relationship so we can have 10% more positive affect in our relationships. The reason we're talking about intimacy is really for 2 reasons. Number 1, so that we can more intimately know God, and so that we can more powerfully be involved in relationships that reflect God's heart and his nature. And so if you're married, my hope would be that with this information that you're able to go deeper with your spouse. And that as you do that, as you grow in intimacy, who you are begins to burgeon and flourish and thrive. So the definition of intimacy, and then there's 3 components of intimacy that I want to talk about. And remember, last week with the webinar, I sent you a document called Intimacy Handout, rather creatively named. And I'm now on, I believe, page 2 of that handout. The 3 components of intimacy are ownership, expression, and validation. And the reason why these are important to pay attention to is that if there are 2 people in a relationship, at any given time, there's one of these things going on for one person and one going on for the other person. And there's also ways that we can do the opposite of these. So we're going to talk about disowning. We're going to talk about not expressing. We're going to talk about invalidating. So with no further ado, let's jump in. Ownership. Ownership is the first essential component of intimacy, and ownership has to do with being who we are. Think about it this way, that if I'm my false self, and if I'm in relationship with you or with a woman that I fall in love with and I'm going to marry her, if I'm still living as a poser, and if I'm still living out of me being an imposter with her, never exposing my weaknesses, never letting her in on my story, never letting her know how I'm wounded, then it's impossible to have an intimate relationship. It's what I call, at best, pseudo-intimacy. And going back to the myths, there may be ingredients of intimacy in the relationship. There might be great sex, or there might be disclosing, feelings. There might be a sense of, or a perceived sense of, emotional closeness. There might be a lot of time spent together, but none of those things are inherently intimacy, because one of the persons is being their false self. So ownership has to do with reclaiming and embracing within ourselves the most real part of who we are that is often disowned early in life. So ownership has to do with being who we are, but specifically reclaiming and embracing who we most really are, that part of us that was disowned early in life. And if you're saying, what are you talking about? I would ask you, if you don't know who you are, and I talked about this on the Restoring Freedom weekend, think back to when you were a little boy. Think back to a happy memory. Do you remember when we went around the circle and we asked the question to share a positive memory or a positive story, and how we all felt drawn to one another and to those stories, and how in many ways that was a more holy moment than when people shared their brokenness. And so if you don't know who you are or what your truest self is think back to that little boy. So for me, it's that 5-year-old little boy that dreamt of growing up and being fill in the blank. In 4th grade, this is an unusual story that I haven't told for a long time, but in 4th grade, and how old would I have been then? I would have been 9 years old. In 4th grade, I brought in a science kit that I received from Christmas. And I had taken a little cake pan that you bake a cake in, and I had melted wax in it so that I could dissect a frog. And you pin the frog down into the wax, and that's how you do dissection. In 4th grade, at 9 years old, I brought a frog in and I dissected it in front of my whole class for science class. And I was able to name the parts and the internal organs. Now, I don't know a lot of 9-year-olds that dissect frogs in front of their science class, but I remember in 5th grade and 6th grade and 7th grade and all throughout high school and most of college thinking how dumb I was. But how in 4th grade, before certain things happened in my family and certain elements of my family broke apart and trust was violated, I remember thinking that I was a pretty bright kid and that I could do pretty much whatever I wanted to do within certain limits. But something happened in my story, and I began to disown, to suppress, to negate, to relegate who I was. And what happened is that if you think of a heart as a whole, and along comes a person's story where they're wounded, a part of their heart starts to fragment and break off, and eventually the heart begins to fracture. And that's what the nature of brokenness does, and that's why Jesus said that he came to make the heart whole and to bind up the heart. We disown who we are in the places of our wounds and our shame and our weaknesses. And intimacy always begins not with disowning, but with owning, reclaiming and embracing within ourselves the most real part of who we are. The second component of ownership is that in present day relationships, this is the part of us that we will be tempted to compromise, silence, or ignore. Again, so if you want to know where you struggle in intimacy, it's the place that you tend to compromise, like, oh, I don't care if we go to that restaurant. I don't like that food anyway at the other place that I mentioned. Compromising ourselves is always a temptation when we believe that we can't be who we are in relationship to another person and still be accepted. So silencing yourself is not speaking with your God-given voice, or ignoring your longings and desires inside. And when a person does that, they basically not only disown themselves, but they become dead. They become a chameleon, and they become defined by what others want them to be. The third aspect of ownership, once a person reclaims and embraces who they are and says, I'm not going to silence myself or compromise myself anymore, this involves holding on to ourselves, not losing ourselves again, especially when we are provoked, when we are triggered, when we otherwise get our buttons pushed. So we can all relate to an interaction or an event or a relationship where we feel like we are our normal self, or maybe even our best self, but then someone makes a comment, or they look at us in a particular way, or they don't return a phone call, or they don't, if it's your spouse, they say no to you when you move toward them for physical affection or for sex. And so based on you not getting what you want, you somehow lose your sense of identity. And in counseling circles and in the work that I do, I talk with couples and I talk with men about holding on to yourself, which presumes that you need to have a self to hold on to. Now that brings up the question right away, well, what if I don't have a self? What if I don't know who I am? Then the work of healing and restoration is asking Jesus in that beautiful prayer that John Eldredge has taught us, Jesus, give me my whole heart back. Jesus, give me my whole heart back. I don't know who I am. And he will do that over time. But if you don't know who you are and you're struggling with a porn addiction or a sex addiction, the focal point is not to go after the sinful behavior. It's to become who you are. It's to discover your heart. It's to discover your true identity. So that's ownership, component number one of intimacy. Component number two of intimacy is expression. And just like it sounds, expression is the idea of expressing what's inside of you. But more than that, it's remaining engaged with the other person while offering and making vulnerable the most real part of who you are. So if I want Chinese and my wife wants to go out for a steak, and I'm just really counting on Chinese, and the last 3 times we have gone out, she's gotten her choice, and it really hasn't been a big deal to me, but tonight I want Chinese. And if she says, well, let's go out to eat tonight, and I was thinking steak, what do you think? At that point, expression is me actually speaking up, literally having a voice and expressing myself. Staying engaged with her instead of either, on the one hand, escalating and making her pay for wanting steak, or on the other hand, withdrawing. And I'll talk about those two things in a minute. Remaining engaged with the other person while continuing to offer what's real in me, but what might in fact be vulnerable to express. You know, a number of men come to me as they are healing from their addictions and saying, you know, I just don't know how to connect with my wife. I just don't know how to do intimacy. And the bottom line is there's no easy steps, but the theme throughout is risk being who you are, and therefore be vulnerable in sharing your wants, your needs, your feelings, etc. It's so tempting to share stories, especially short stories of damage and sometimes of all the things that have happened to us, than it is to share our more present moment needs, because that's more vulnerable. Second part of expression is that in present day relationships, expression involves expressing our feelings, our thoughts, our wants, our needs, our desires, opinions, and boundaries. So, you know, we've all heard of the classic doormat, either the woman who is in a relationship who is a doormat, or the man who is oftentimes called the nice guy, you know, the guy that will never, ever, ever create conflict. And I told the story in Surfing for God, and it's absolutely true, of the man who I asked him a question. I did an intensive with him about 3 years ago, and I asked him a question. I said, you know, what do you think of conflict? Do you avoid conflict? Do you like conflict? Can you handle conflict? And he looked at me with a straight face and he said, I write avoid conflict at the top of my to-do list every morning. Absolutely committed to avoiding conflict and one of the nicest guys that you would ever meet. And that was exactly his wife's problem. His wife said, he's the nicest guy in the world. He doesn't create conflict. He doesn't fight. I feel crazy because I'm so unhappy in my marriage. And what she meant by that was that she didn't know his heart. He never shared his feelings. He never shared his thoughts. He agreed with everything she did. That's not a relationship. That's a monologue with a companion attached to it. So for there to be intimacy, and I'm talking about emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy, relational intimacy and friendship, but specifically physical intimacy, all of these components have to be there. Ownership, expression, and as I'll talk about in a minute, validation. So people can have sex and not have intimacy. I work with a lot of couples for whom sex and physical intimacy are a substitute for what they don't have emotionally. And the lie that they tell themselves is, if I have regular sex, then we must have intimacy and our relationship must be okay. And then they hit a speed bump or something happens and they realize the relationship is really just built around their physical activity. And it's not even necessarily good physical activity. So ownership, expression, and then the last part of intimacy is validation. And validation is on both sides of the equation. Excuse me. That's not an alcoholic beverage. That's a cream soda that I'm drinking, honestly. Validation is the third component of intimacy, and this involves responding rather than reacting to the other person's feelings, thoughts, desires, needs as well. So if my wife says, I want to go out for steak and I want to go out for Chinese, and if I'm hurt or angry by that, if I respond and I say, honey, I hear that you want to go out to steak and I know that you love steak, and you may even have low iron in your blood and you're craving meat because it has a lot of iron in it, but I hear that you really want to do that, but we have not gotten to go where I wanted to go for the last 5 times, and I've been counting on Chinese all day. I've just validated her, but I've also validated myself. Now, do you see what I mean by validation is really twofold? It's validating the other person, but it's not just compromising and giving them what they want or giving them what they're asking for, but it's holding on to myself. Validation also involves being grounded and having a quiet center, not letting our emotions, but especially our physiology, and this is so important when we're triggered, and our spouses can trigger us. As men, our spouses can make us feel shame. Our spouses can make us feel inadequate, incompetent, small. And especially if you have trauma in your background, sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, where people have had power over you and wounded you, where wounds of presence or wounds of absence have been there. If you have trauma from that, you are much more likely for your buttons to be pushed in relationship. And when your spouse does the equivalent of saying, well, I want to go out for steak, if your temptation is not to shut down, and even if it is your temptation to shut down, chances are, if you have trauma in your background, that eventually the volcano is going to blow. That you'll only say, oh, I don't care where we go out to eat, when you really do care where you go out to eat. You can only do that so many times before the volcano blows and before the anger and the resentment and all of the story that you tell yourself begins to come out and be poured out onto the other person like hot lava. See, that's why it's so important to be able to have a quiet center and to be able to get grounded, because when we get triggered, our brain chemicals are being released. There's adrenaline and cortisol in our body. Our heart might be racing or pounding. Our palms might be sweaty. Our breathing might be escalated. We might feel suddenly sick in the stomach. I knew one man that when he got triggered, his bowels literally went loose. And he didn't mess himself, but it felt like it would. And that's simply a chemical reaction. That's why, not to be crude, but when people say, I was so scared I shit my pants, That is a normal human reaction to fear. And somebody with trauma experiences in the present the same kind of reaction that you had in the past, because a stressor in the present triggered a stressor from the past that's generally much greater than what's happening in the present. We simply interpret it as a form of danger in the present. So validation is responding rather than reacting to the other person's feelings. It's staying grounded and getting to that quiet center instead of letting yourself be ruled by the physiological reactions and the trauma. And then finally, validation requires identifying ways that we tend to invalidate. So what's invalidation? Marriage counselors will work with couples around two things: invalidation and negative interpretation, and they're like opposite ends of a continuum. On the one end of the continuum, invalidation is to dismiss and discount the other person's thoughts and feelings and opinions. And so if my wife, it's 90 degrees out and it's a warm summer day, and we're sitting in the house and the air conditioning is off and all the doors are open, and she says to me, "Oh, I'm freezing in here." For me to invalidate her would be able to say, "It's not cold in here." Or to say to her, "Well, you should go put on a sweater because you're just always so cold." See, to invalidate is to simply dismiss and discount. So we do this all the time, in political discussions. "Oh, I'm going to vote for so-and-so. Oh, that guy's an idiot. I would never vote for him." Invalidation happens in relationships, and when it happens in relationships, if people buy into the invalidation, or if they accept the invalidation and say, "Yeah, that's who I am," it actually perpetuates a disowning of who we are, and it drives a wedge down the middle of what would otherwise be an intimate relationship. So invalidation is dismissing and discounting the other person. And then there's, over on the other end of the continuum, if this is invalidation on this end of the continuum, on this end of the continuum is negative interpretation. And negative interpretation is when we perceive and interpret the words and the communication and the body language that's coming from the other person, and we're perceiving it through our own wound. So let's say that my wife is sitting across from me at a very expensive 25th anniversary dinner, and I roll my eyes like this. And she says, "Oh, so I just told you that I'm really, really proud of our kids and for just how they've grown this year, and you rolled your eyes. I really feel like you think I'm stupid and you don't care about my thoughts and opinions." And if in fact I rolled my eyes because I was frustrated with her, or I was sick of listening to her, or tired of her, opinions, then she would be correct. But what if I had a speck of dust or a piece of crab shell from our dinner popped up into my eye, and I'm rolling my eyes because there's an irritation in my eye, but she's interpreting my eye roll as I'm blowing her off, I'm dismissing her. Now, it's a silly example, but it's also a concrete example. Very often, what we perceive in relationships is not accurate. The communication that we're hearing. And one of the simple things to help us own ourselves and to learn to express ourselves and ultimately to be able to validate the other person is simply to check things out and to say, "Can I check something out with you? Right after the waiter dropped off the crab in front of you, which looks delicious, by the way, I noticed that you rolled your eyes, and it happened to be right after what I said about the kids. Were you blowing me off?" "Oh, no, honey, I'm so sorry. I got a piece of crab shell in my eye." "Oh, okay. By the way, I thought what you said about the kids was really cool. Thank you for sharing your heart." Something that simple can help, as opposed to simply believe everything that we think and everything that we feel. Our feelings can be profound windows into the soul and indicators of what's happening inside of us, but don't believe everything you feel, and don't believe everything you think, because our thinking is based on our perception, and our perception is oftentimes very, very faulty, triggered by and guided by our wounding and the lies that we believe. So that's validation. It involves owning our patterns of invalidation and owning our own patterns of negative interpretation. When we're aware of how we misinterpret and negatively interpret, and aware of how we invalidate, it's then that we can actually validate people. And instead of see people as an enemy, we can see them as an ally, but as a separate person with whom we can disagree. Today, my wife and I went out to lunch, true story. And she shared some things that I absolutely disagreed with. And yet I was able to, by God's grace, stay connected to her and listen to her and say, I hear that that's really, really, really hard for you, and you feel these feelings in the present moment. And I hear you. And I want to have a conversation about that because I perceive things very, very differently. And in the past, I would have literally have just humphed or rolled my eyes or told her that she was wrong to feel that way or something like that. And so self-knowledge and an awareness of our patterns is really, really important as we relate to others and as we hope to grow in intimacy. So those are the components of intimacy. And now I want to talk about barriers to intimacy. And I'm just going to talk about this very quickly because I want to get into more material tonight and hopefully get through this. Barriers to intimacy that are internal to us: shame or other negative core beliefs. So if I'm wrapped up in shame, or if I'm believing a lie about who I am, then I'm going to, apart from God's grace and repentance, I'm going to keep a fig leaf over myself. I'm going to hide a part of who I am. I'm not going to be vulnerable. So I'm not saying that we need to get rid of all of our shame and lies before we can be intimate, but not having an awareness of them, and when those lies and fig leaves are in operation, without that knowledge, chances are we will never get very close to people. Other barriers that are internal in our souls are unaddressed feelings of fear, anger, and sadness, and also expressing those things. You know, I've never been a guy who rages, but I've had a lot of resentment and low-level frustration inside that my story told me, Michael, it's not safe to share that. So you just hold it inside, and if my wife said, "Are you mad at me?" No, I'm not mad at you, but just always kind of feeling irritated and annoyed. Trauma is another internal barrier. Trauma that predisposes you to be triggered in key relationships and to have buttons pushed in key relationships. So those are the internal barriers. Then there are external barriers to intimacy. And the first thing, to be fair to anyone and everyone, is that most people on the planet, what are there now? 7 billion people. 7 billion people are walking around on the planet with a skill deficit in regards to intimacy. And, you know, my son jokes all the time, and my daughter, who's 13, just said this, that sometimes it's a liability having two therapists for parents. You know, because when my son was in kindergarten, they went around the circle and asked, "What's your favorite word?" You know, and some people said, "My favorite word is the color blue because that's my favorite color." You know, my favorite word is snowflake because I love the snow. You get the point. When they got to my son said that his favorite word was ambivalent. You know, the state of having contradicting emotions. Now, not only did he know that word, he liked how it sounded, but he had heard us use it a lot. That's a side note, but sometimes it's a liability to have parents as therapists. But even someone who grows up with parents who are therapists or who have a PhD in communication, they have a skill deficit in intimacy. And here's why. Because all of us have the default setting of covering what we believe to be shameful or inadequate or not measuring up. We all have the default setting of covering ourselves with a fig leaf. And the skill comes in learning how to be vulnerable and learning how to trust. And I've referred to this before, but I strongly encourage you to read a book by Brené Brown. The book is called Rising Strong, and the book before that is called Daring Greatly. And the book Daring Greatly is all about vulnerability. She has another book called The Gifts of Imperfection. Her first name is spelled like Rene, R-E-N-E, with a little French hyphen on it, but with a B in the front. Brene and then Brown. Daring Greatly, The Gifts of Imperfection, and Rising Strong. She's written profoundly about these very issues. So skill deficit is another. And then the second external barrier to conflict that's not within us, but something on the outside that happens between people, is unhealthy patterns of handling conflict. And if you do have the handout in front of you, notice that it says unhealthy patterns of conflict. There's no P there. I need to correct that. But not only do couples have invalidation and negative interpretation on this cross continuum, but if you look on a vertical continuum, couples tend to escalate and withdraw and then negatively interpret and invalidate. So there's a 4-point grid with escalation at the top and withdrawal at the bottom. And escalation has to do with escalating emotionally, verbally, or physically, getting louder, using swear words, trying to convince the other person, generally turning the faucet of words on to get the other person to engage. Withdrawal is generally shutting the faucet off, and that can be emotional, verbal, or physical. Emotional withdrawal can be the silent treatment, and emotional escalation can be greater intensity. Emotional or verbal withdrawal can be the silent treatment and simply disengaging from a person physically. On an escalation level, physical escalation can be slamming doors, throwing things, ultimately domestic violence. And so you get the pattern. Unhealthy patterns are that conflict and communication, and remember, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. For a healthy relationship, conflict can draw people together and build trust and build connection. But for unhealthy people that are easily triggered, have a skill deficit, they tend to fall into one of these 4 patterns of escalating, withdrawing, invalidating, negatively interpreting. Okay, now this is the good stuff. And I, in part, want to go through this very quickly, but I think since right now there's only a handful of people that are watching, what I'm going to do is take a little longer and perhaps use the full hour to go through this. And if we don't have time for questions, you can email those questions to me, but maybe we will have time for questions. Patrick Carnes talks about in a number of his books the 7 dimensions of intimacy. And I'm going to simply walk through these. And these are in the handout that I sent last week. And there's 2 columns for each one of these dimensions. For example, for the first dimension, it's the dimension of initiative. And each of these dimensions are things that are required for intimacy. And without these elements and these dimensions, a person will not be able to have ownership, expression, and validation. So you'll see how those 3 fit in. I'm sure we could make some kind of 3-dimensional grid that represented this on an iPhone app or something. But there's 2 columns. There's a healthy form of, to use the example of initiative, the first dimension of intimacy, there's healthy initiative and unhealthy initiative. There is healthy presence and unhealthy presence. So let's jump in. Of the 7 dimensions that Patrick Carnes discusses, the first one is initiative. And what healthy intimacy looks like in the area of initiative is calling upon others, initiating, engaging with others to either offer help or ask for help, to seek an opinion or to share an opinion. But without initiative, it's just being in relationship with a turtle with their head and their legs pulled in. And they're physically there, but they're not really there. Unhealthy initiative looks in the form of passivity or control. It says that another element of healthy initiative is reaching out to others. The unhealthy version of that is isolation, not reaching out. Healthy form of initiative is risking expressions of caring, taking that risk, being vulnerable. The unhealthy version of that is acting like a victim. Healthy initiative inviting others to share activities. Do you see it's moving into your world? It's picking up the phone and calling someone. It's sending someone an email. It's writing a card, as opposed to having this belief that is unhealthy initiative that things just happen to me. I can't act on my world. I can't affect change. The locus of control in my life is really external, not internal. Things happen to me. Finally, another two elements of healthy initiative is sharing problems and concerns versus feeling like you have no control over your life. And on the unhealthy side, there's really a big theme through all of these. It's victim mentality, it's passivity, living where you're not empowered. Finally, I love this because it relates to sexual addiction. I'm able to express desire and attraction. Healthy initiative is the feelings that are inside me in terms of desiring connection, closeness, affirmation. I can actually express that versus believing that people will abandon me or not meet my needs or anything like that. Are you starting to see this? That each of these components are an ingredient, or as Karen says, and a dimension of intimacy without which there's a part of us that's just checked out of the relationship. Now, some of these have carryover. For example, the second dimension of intimacy is presence. Presence, not Santa Claus is coming to town and giving me presents. Healthy presence is initiating activities and sharing the feelings that come with that. Unhealthy intimacy is allowing your feelings and the things that you'd want to do to constrict and to shut down inside of you, and basically to not share those. The presence of meeting others, showing up in relationship and for relationship, and listening versus being present to others and not being available, or simply being present but you're not really there. You know, you're there but you're not really there. And of course, not showing up, being undependable, being utterly disengaged, being isolated, paying attention to others and the world around us versus deflecting positive attention around us and away from us, and believing that we don't deserve either one, positive attention from others or about the world or from the world around us. It's really important that when we are in a room of people, that we're really there. And this requires attentiveness to what's happening in us in the moment versus being so checked out that we're not even aware that we're not there. I remember my wife saying to me again and again early in our marriage, you know, I feel like when we go out to dinner or when we sit down at dinner, it feels like you're there, but you're not really there. And I'd just be flummoxed by that because I had no idea what she was talking about. What do you mean I'm here, but I'm not here? And it would make me so frustrated. And that's because I was so disconnected from my heart. So I encourage you to take each of these dimensions of intimacy and walk through this handout with yourself first, and then to sit down with your spouse or person that you're in closest relationship with and walk down and let them give you feedback about these. So for presence, it talks about opening up with your feelings versus, and this is clearly an addictive word, our obsessions and addictions blocking our attention and opportunities that might come our way. Taking part in activities with others regularly is a healthy form of presence, obviously being physically present. And then I like this, noticing details. To be physically present means that you pay attention and you notice things like, oh, to your wife, you changed the color of your hair, or is that a new outfit, or you got your nails done, or wow, the house looks especially clean today. See, a lot of times a spouse may say, well, you never give me compliments, and we can try to give them compliments, and they say, well, you're still not giving me enough compliments, when in fact, although compliments are a nice thing to do, it's actually that they don't feel like you're emotionally present when you're with them. And they might say that they need compliments as a way of feeling your emotional presence. So don't just go through the motion and do the behavior, look at your heart and ask the question, am I really, really present? I have my mission statement written on the wall right here. It's on a handout, and I'm going to read it to you. My mission statement that I recently redeveloped, it says, as a beloved child, husband, father, and friend, I live and love with a whole heart at peace, from which I offer dependable strength, true kindness, and life-giving presence. I am centered in my soul, disciplined and creative in my daily life while being attentive and engaged to my wife and my children. So I didn't write that mission statement out of this is who I am all the time. I wrote that mission statement out of I have a deficit in terms of being dependable. I have a deficit in terms of offering kindness that's true. Instead, I'll just smile and I'll say, sure, I'll do what you want to do, and be angry on the inside. So my mission statement comes out of the deficit of offering kindness that's truthful, where I can say what I really want to say and own who I really am and allow the kindness to come out of that. That's true kindness. Also, this mission statement, the most powerful piece to me that I find compelling is that I want to offer life-giving presence to the people that I love the most and that need me the most. And I can counsel, or I can teach, or I can minister to other men and offering life-giving presence and do that my whole life and be successful at it and never give it to my wife and children. And that's why I wrote down this mission statement. So it's, in one sense, aspirational, but it also taps into the core part of who I am. It taps into the part of me that is most true. So noticing details and being present, initiative, are just different components, or noticing details as a component of the dimension of presence. And another one is initiative. Closure. This is an interesting word. And the first time I read this by Carnes, I thought, how does closure have anything to do with intimacy? Well, true story. I was sitting with my wife the other night. We were sitting by our fireplace, enjoying the fire late in the evening before bed. And she made a comment, and I was sitting there thinking about it, and I didn't realize how long I was thinking about it, and I didn't say anything. And she said, are you going to say anything in response to what I said? And my first thought was, well, of course I'm going to say something, because what you said was so vulnerable and positive, and of course I want to engage with you around that. But little did I know that like 5 minutes had gone by, and I hadn't said anything. And I think in this situation, it's because I was so relaxed, not dissociated or angry or something like that. But closure in a healthy intimacy has to do with finalizing arrangements. So instead of saying, hey, let's have a date night, it means to follow through with it, as opposed to making everything into a crisis. That's the unhealthy example that Carnes gives. And in the unhealthy side here, you may not connect with it in contrast to the healthy part. Come up with your own picture of what the opposite looks like. What's the opposite of finalizing? Acknowledging and caring about others. There's closure that's needed for that, versus being so out of control. And so overextended that loose ends are everywhere in my life. I remember about 2 years before I was married, I was working 80 hours a week at a hospital, and it was Christmas Eve, and I was driving to another family member's house, and my youngest sister picked me up, and at the time we had a very codependent relationship. And I didn't do any Christmas shopping. And I called her before she picked me up, and I said, will you go buy Christmas presents for me for the rest of the family? You know, I had a crisis, and I didn't have any closure or finalizing of gifts for Christmas. And it was the first time she said to me, no, I won't do that. No, I won't do that. You've got a problem. You've got to grow up. You've got to deal with the way that you're so overextended and your life is so out of control. Carnes uses a healthy example of closure of acknowledging others who desire my time or who are attracted to me, as opposed to avoiding closure. I just talked to someone on the phone who is a very, very successful business person, and they've invited me to come to their town and to speak to a group. And they said to me, Michael, like you're so busy, and with our business and the way that things are growing, we realize how many people demand things of you. And internally, I had the thought, yeah, it's just easier to not return phone calls and emails, and sometimes they slip through the cracks. But it's just a whole lot easier to ignore things sometimes than it is to actually get on the phone and tell people, no, I can't do that, or to have to make a hard decision that brings closure to something. And so to move into closure, as Carnes is talking about, means, excuse me, to not avoid and to bring resolution to problems, concerns, and requests. Okay? And then Carnes uses the example of closure as a way of saying thank you. So, somebody gives you a gift, somebody comes and speaks to your group, somebody holds the door open for you. Do you just take that for granted, or is there a way of having closure and appropriately sharing your gratitude to kind of close the loop, versus if you never say thank you to that person that sends you a gift, or invites you over for a meal and really goes out of their way and makes a special evening? If you never say thank you, there's something that's left unsaid and incomplete, and there may be a question in that person's mind. Are they really appreciative? Do they really care? Did they hate my food? Do they not like my company? So thanks and expressing gratitude is an important part of closure. We've already talked about it, but vulnerability is an important dimension of intimacy. And I'm going to just quickly blow through this, but sharing problems, sharing concerns versus keeping your thoughts private. Years ago, I said to my wife, she said, how come we're not friends with so-and-so, this one couple? And the wife was really neat, and my wife really connected with the wife, and she wanted me to connect with the husband. And I just said, that man has no need. We would get together and spend time together, but he doesn't need me, and he doesn't need anything or anyone. He knows it all, and apart from that, he just doesn't need relationships. And I don't need to be in a relationship where someone doesn't need a relationship, except for occasional having a good time or just an enjoyable time together. But the person was closed off. They were guarded. It was hard to know anything about them. And the mask that they wore was being in control, knowing everything, having something to contribute or something to offer in every topic, etc. Vulnerability, sharing your thinking and your process of thinking, sharing your feelings and how you got to feeling what you're feeling. Vulnerability can be involving other people in decisions. This has become very powerful in the corporate world and in the organizational world. Collaboration. A great word for a marriage. I want my marriage to be collaborative, where my wife and I are allies, where we're working together for the same cause, toward the common goal. Vulnerability will be that I reveal myself and share who I am with others. And not just my dark story and my pain, but who I really am. Talking about myself can be a really healthy thing, not just a unhealthy or narcissistic thing. Nurturing is another dimension of relationship. And this can be making caring statements, letting others know that you care for them, being empathic. And Brené Brown defines empathy in a beautiful way. She says that empathy can be in both words, but more than that, in a nonverbal sense, that sense of how we communicate to others. Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. So we don't need to have shared the exact experience that the other person is having, but we can have empathy by going, I get it. I get it. I know what that's like to feel that way. So nurturing includes empathy versus not allowing other people to have their feelings or discounting and diminishing them, which is invalidation. Supporting others, making suggestions, helping others in need, providing feedback to others, letting other people know that they have value, all obviously different acts of care. And unhealthy would be to withhold ourselves, to withhold affection, our input, our observations, etc. Another dimension of intimacy, honesty. Honesty. And honesty is not always about, quote, telling the truth, although it's at least telling the truth, but it's more than that. Augusten Burroughs, who is the author of the book Running with Scissors, which became a movie about 10 years ago, Augusten Burroughs said, I know some people who have never told a lie, who, although they've never told a lie, they're not very truthful and they live a false life. So honesty has to do with far more than that. Honesty that Carnes talks about in relationship to intimacy is acknowledging that you have positive and negative feelings. So it can be dishonest to just be upbeat all the time, just to be optimistic. And that's not telling a lie, it's just not being honest with yourself. Being clear about your priorities and your values. So, it's the chameleon who, when he's in group A, he values and prioritizes this, but when he's in group B, he values this. He's a Democrat here and a Republican here, or he's a liberal here and a conservative there, or he, likes vegan food with this group, and over here, he loves beef and steak and killing small animals. Honesty can be owning disagreements and conflict. So I was dishonest and couldn't live with a free sense of this dimension of intimacy back when my wife would say, "Are you mad at me?" And I'd say, "No." Why? Because I had to disown anger. In my mind, I had to disown anger in order for her to be okay with me. Another element of intimacy that Carnes talks about, and this is so important, is play. And so many addicts have play in their life compulsively or not at all. So it's the guy that runs, 50 marathons, or the person who is, so engrossed in hunting that it's actually an addiction and it's an avoidance. But healthy play, being able to see the humor in life versus serious all the time, putting effort into leisure time and developing hobbies, celebrating joyful events, exploring new ventures with family and friends, stopping to smell the flowers. Play oftentimes includes enjoying children. It's no surprise that Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." Why? Because if you're so serious and if you're a hardcore Pharisee, you're not gonna want to be around kids. They're a pain in the butt. But if you can play and be light, then children are delightful. And just being able to laugh. So those are the 7 dimensions of intimacy. And I have a brief section here on the long-term path of intimacy. For intimacy to happen, it's a long-term commitment to restoration. And if you are an addict, it's not just getting sober and then you can be intimate, but it's a long-term path to restoration. And it's living loved. Living loved. Notice in my mission statement, I am a beloved child of the living God, of the King of Kings, of my Heavenly Father. I'm not a slave, I'm not an orphan, but I'm a child and I'm a son, and I live loved. And out of that sense of belovedness flows all kinds of life, the life of Christ. The last thing is differentiation, and I'm not going to take the time to read this quote, but differentiation is a polishing process whereby we become ourselves and we become separate from our spouse and the people in our lives. It's really, in fact, us owning more and more of who we are. So that's it on intimacy, part 1 and part 2. I hope you watch these videos. I hope you have a chance to sit down and watch them with your spouse. There is 4 minutes left, but I see there's only a couple of viewers live right now. So if you have a question, feel free to text it on the side and to write it in. But if not, I'm so glad for tonight and for the opportunity to talk about intimacy. Continue to pray for all of you and miss you all from the weekend. And do send me email, michael@restoringthesoul.com. Let me know how I can pray for you and let us know what you need. Not a big solicitation here, but just remember, because you attended the Restoring Freedom Intensive, you have a 10% discount on a soul care intensive at Restoring the Soul. If you're in ministry or run a nonprofit organization, you get our ministry deep discount. But either way, you get a 10% discount on the intensives. And check those out at restoringthesoul.com. Blessings to all of you, and thanks for listening tonight. Have a great week. Bye-bye.